pipeline. So our program equips participants with the language and tools to better understand their experiences, to advocate for themselves in the face of anti-Black racism and gender-based violence. We're hoping to create spaces for collective healing that centers safety, care, empowerment, and education, and ensuring that Black youth impacted by criminalization in education can build some allyship, solidarity, and personal advocacy. So we've had a series of educational legal workshops. We still have some coming up in April as well, where people can explore the intersections of law, justice, and their lived experiences. And workshops will be facilitated by Black women whose values and lived realities reflect those of the participants. So together we will foster meaningful opportunities for some dialogue, collective reflection, and skill building, so we can strengthen our power and strengthen each other while our experiences are too often overlooked. And that is it for me. I'm going to pass it over to Andrea to introduce herself and talk a little bit about her organization and what we can expect today.
Hey folks, name's Andrea Vasquez Jimenez, gender pronoun she, her, ella. And today's teaching is, as a disclaimer, it is a snapshot of a particular time and space, both historical and contemporary, as the present state of police and policing in schools across so-called Canada. And today's focus, what's currently known today as Ontario, is going to be the major focus. However, how police and policing is situated within the province and so-called Canada continues to shift and will continue to do so after today's teaching. Ahead of time, I do want to provide a content warning. I'll provide content warnings and activation warnings throughout of police violence, in particular, including gender-based violence, including sexual violence. And prior to getting started, if folks do feel comfortable, we are going to be interacting throughout the duration, but as well as afterwards. And if folks would want to input their age, or if they have a specific school board or post-secondary institution that they may be attending, that they're able to put in the chat. That way I can connect the particular landscape and terrains of policing in schools directly to your school boards. We're going to really be delving into not just the landscape and terrains of policing in schools historically, but also what that means present day today with Bill 33 that has already become legislation, and what that means in regards to the school prison nexus, which we will also definitely delve into that. And so I want to first ground us in the land acknowledgement, also acknowledging that police and policing carceral measures have always impacted Indigenous peoples. And so before moving forward, we'd like to acknowledge that we are on stolen Indigenous land across Turtle Island, and recognize that these lands have been and continue to be inhabited by many nations of Indigenous peoples since time immemorial. And while we're gathering from multiple Indigenous lands and connecting through this virtual space, I want to acknowledge specifically where Policing Free Schools is based, and myself as well. And that is based out of what is currently known today as Toronto, and acknowledging the original peoples of these lands, the Mississaugas of New Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples who also called these lands home. I want to also acknowledge the stolen Indigenous lands where many of you are calling in from today, from across what is currently called today Ontario, traditional territory to many Indigenous nations and peoples. Acknowledging as well those who came here involuntarily with an African ancestral acknowledgement, and recognizing that also policing carceral measures detrimentally impact Black and African diasporic, including Black Afro-Indigenous peoples. And so acknowledging those who came here involuntarily as a result of the transatlantic enslavement trade, and honoring and paying tribute to ancestors of African origin and descent. So a little bit about Policing Free Schools, and then I'll get into my particular entry point into this work. So Policing Free Schools, we are a community-based organization. We are grassroots. We are a volunteer-based organization. And we are dedicated to moving towards a paradigm shift, moving from spaces that are harmful, that are punitive, moving towards the co-creation of transformative, healthy, equitable, life-affirming, liberatory, healing-centered, and policing-free educational spaces. And at Policing Free Schools, we support our partners to strategize, organize, analyze, and mobilize. We do a lot of education, political education, and awareness building around these issues, and also pushing for policy and legislative changes. We also, of course, work alongside people and organizational partners, both across the province, the country, and also across colonial borders, understanding that this is a systemic issue. And some of our international partners are based out of what is currently called today the United States, the United Kingdom, and South Africa, and we make part of a growing global movement. And so prior to getting to the roadmap, my particular entry point into this work actually came from when I was part of a different grassroots organization. And it was actually the young people. It was students themselves at a youth education forum that was hosted by the organization that I was with at that time. And it was the young people speaking to how they were being detrimentally, negatively impacted by police presence. And it was both from the Toronto District School Board students and also the Toronto Catholic District School Board students. And since then, a lot of the work at Policing Free Schools has really shifted, just not just looking at police presence or police and school programs, but rather looking at policing and carceral measures, including and beyond police presence. So first up for today's roadmap, we're going to be collectively rooted, and I'm going to collectively root us in a baseline of frameworks, including research, data, definitions, and realities. We're then going to be looking at a very 101 Ontario provincial landscape and terrains of police and policing in schools. We're going to delve into Ontario Bill 33 and looking at how this legislation actually has, even prior to being legislated, has already changed the landscape for organizing and advocacy, and ways on how folks can get involved with our upcoming initiatives surrounding structural care and collective resistance. There are going to be moments and touch points of community knowledge exchange weaved throughout, in case if folks prefer to engage through that format, but I do want to advise folks that there is going to be a time for engagement for afterwards as well. Just wanting to recognize that it is a heavy topic, and in many instances, the vast amount of information on interconnected issues, of course, with impact of policing on people's lived realities, in many instances may be very overwhelming. So folks are able to definitely engage, and feel free to unmute or put stuff in the chat. I have another screen up, so I'm able to see the chat as well in case. And so in regards to being collectively rooted in the reality that there is a normalized assumption that safe and safety equates with police presence and increased police spending, right? And so folks who are here with us in your spaces and the people y'all have access to, is this a narrative that y'all have noticed, that folks equate police with safety, increased police presence with creating safety? And feel free to unmute or put into chat your responses, but also if you'd like to reflect afterwards, that's definitely an option. But if folks do put stuff into the chat, I'll definitely be looking at it and referencing an engagement as well. So meanwhile, we know that police presence, policing, and increased police spending does not actually equate to safety, that this is very much a false narrative. It is not the reality. When in reality, we know that thriving and healthy communities, including educational spaces, which in and of themselves are safe, have more supports and resources, not more policing, right? We have more than enough reports, data, this data from police spending, a University of Toronto multi-longitudinal study showed that, again, what we already know, that there is no consistent correlation with reduction of crime or increased safety. And so, again, when looking at this Canadian study published, it examined a decade's worth of data of Canada's 20 largest municipalities. And the result of that study was that, again, as police budgets continued to increase, there wasn't any association. And despite ample reports and research for years, we continue to see how elected officials they continue to choose to prioritize siphoning money out of our communities and funneling those funds into policing. And so Priscilla mentions, yes, discipline and law to keep us in check, parents threatening to call the police on you to young children as a joke or form of discipline based in fear. Absolutely. And that speaks to like socialization. In many instances, socialization of police as punitive to safety, in many instances, doesn't just start at school. In many instances, it starts at home. And so what we continue to see is, meanwhile, governments continuously chronically underfund education, healthcare, social service supports, to name a few. There's a plundering of funds into policing. And actually, right now, Ontario is doing an infrastructure for jailing, increasing jailing capacity through an Ontario prison expansion, right? And so we know that creating conditions for healthy communities supports the co-creation of healthy schools, and vice versa, particularly because schools exist within and are part of our communities. Likewise, similarly, when we look at the data and research relating to police and schools, there's little to no evidence that police and school programs prevents or reduces violence in educational spaces. And there's no evidence to support the notion that these programs make educational spaces safer. What police presence does is harm. It is grounded in punitive measures, including impacting academic achievements of students, educational outcomes, and student well-being. As a result, also impacting graduation rates, students' mental health, their physical well-being. And despite there being ample evidence, again, and student testimonials, both recent graduates, former students, and current students, we continuously see that data, research, qualitative data, which are the testimonials, continuously being ignored. And what we know is that students' learning conditions are workers' working conditions. And what research shows is that smaller classroom sizes, ample supports and resources, including but not limited to increase in teachers, education workers, support staff, wraparound services before and after school programming, among school food programs, clean water, clean air, addressing root causes, addressing social and structural determinants of health and equity is what actually creates healthy educational spaces, which in and of themselves are safe and co-creates conditions for students' well-being and academic excellence. And so in case if this is, again, a narrative that folks have seen within their spaces that is continuously ignored and rather that normalized assumption that police equates safety. And again, although our focus today will be regarding police presence and police and school programs, it's important for folks to recognize, again, that policing and carceral measures within schools exist beyond police presence, including in practices, policies, culture, and infrastructure, which we'll see a bit later. So at Policing Free Schools, we're in alignment with the collective campaign definition with our U.S. national campaign partners, the Advancement Project and the Alliance for Educational Justice. And that is dismantling school policing infrastructure, culture, and practice, ending school militarization and surveillance, and building a new liberatory education system. So even though today we're focused on police presence and police and school programs, just for a takeaway for folks to fundamentally understand that it's not just about what is it that we're dismantling, but also what is it that we're co-creating. And so over the years, as a Police Free Schools organizer, initially being in solidarity and connecting and knowledge exchanging with other organizers and those impacted by police violence, was really able to delve into an analysis what had been happening a few years ago within and across our terrains and landscape. And so we saw a sudden co-optation of the original call for Police Free Schools. We saw that educational institutions were solely equating the call with the act of removing their particular police in the school program. schooling spaces were not doing the ongoing critical work that was being demanded of them. Educational spaces who never had a police in school program were claiming that they are police free, and really acknowledging that educational spaces weren't actually moving towards a trajectory of the ongoing transformation, right? They never actually saw that the removal of police presence had always been a first and necessary step on a larger journey. And so that's why we say policing free schools. It's a tactic to combat co-optation. It's our rallying call and affirmation. And it directly recognizes and brings us towards a reality that, again, that policing carceral measures show up within educational spaces beyond the presence of a police officer. And so when we're looking at, today we're going to be talking a little, briefly about the school-prison nexus as well, which shifts away from the pipeline metaphor. And the pipeline metaphor, in many instances, it collapses the nuances, particularly when we're thinking about it solely being unidirectional, when in reality, it's more so of a carceral web, of a nexus, meaning recognizing caring professions within schooling spaces as a way for punitive measures, as one of those pathways. So caring professions such as social workers with their mandatory reporting, talking about the child and family policing system, or others may know it as child welfare, or CAS, and so forth, and really recognizing how these institutions operate in collusion. And so Erica Miners really talks about the linkages between schools and jails being less a pipeline, but more a persistent nexus or a web of intertwined punitive threads, right? And that the nexus really encompasses this carceral cultural control, as Nunez Eddy mentions, again, this operating in collusion to exclude, control, disenfranchise, and oppress beyond just a singular pathway. And so recognizing, although the nexus is always moving forward as a conveyor belt of a pipeline, that it, again, isn't unidirectional, and moving towards with the nexus, it gives way to really amplify those nuances and complexities beyond a linear A to B. And so if folks want to put in the chat or even unmute, again, what are ways that folks recognize policing and carceral measures within their schooling and educational spaces, or not recognizing at all? Again, when we're looking at this tip of the iceberg that we're focusing on today, again, it's police and school program, it's police presence, but what other ways are not as highlighted? And in many ways, right, we see corporal punishment, and many times isn't recognized, when in reality, it still is legal, despite it being a truth and reconciliation call to action number 6. Seclusion and restraint is very much legal. There continuously are these incidents, chemical restraint. We're talking about punitive and exclusionary disciplinary practices. When we're talking about younger ages, isolation, timeouts, looking at technological surveillance, discriminatory dress and hair codes, where people are surveilled, policing of gender expression and sexual orientation, limitations imposed on and challenges to bodily autonomy, right? And in many instances, this policing is very much not just by police officers. In many instances, it is also educators themselves, or even your own peers, because in many instances, we become socialized. And as Mariam Kaba talks about, the cops in our minds and the cops in our hearts. There are practices that are grounded in policing, carceral measures, academic streaming. We're talking about standardized testing. They're all examples of how policing carcerality show up in educational spaces. Culture, logics, infrastructures, practices, and or policies, right? And so for us, we want to make sure that when we're in this conversation, that we're not saying yes to reforms. And I want to give a distinction of reforms. So Critical Resistance, a US-based organization, talks about, reformist reforms, right, which continue or expand the reach of policing, and abolitionist steps, aka non-reformist reforms, that actually work to chip away and reduce its overall impact. And so some of the ways that we've seen, reformist reforms replicate harm. Let me get some water. My voice, I lost it 2 days ago. Thank you. So these are just some of the ways that we have seen over the years when we're talking about a landscape of policing in schools, which we're going to get more in, is that the replication of harm has continued in many of these spaces, whether it be through a creation of a new program, right? Creation of a police-led collaborative school, which we've seen in Regina, Saskatchewan. If you all Google police Scott Academy, the Scott Police Academy, actually, Scott Police Academy, you'll see that your teachers are a police officer and a teacher, and it's quote unquote a collaborative partnership between Regina Police and also the Regina School Board, right? So we've been seeing the renaming, the rebranding, revising, reimagining, updating, right? So for us, it's not also, we're seeing this notion of, oh, as long as you diversify the identities of those police officers, right, for it to be more representative in schools, right? These are all examples. And I see Priscilla mention privatization with funding in social services and arts and culture, militarization and disallowing people to express thinking globally, cuts to funding causing burnout and lateral violence of care workers and teachers. Absolutely. It very much is a systemic issue, and governments know what the solutions are. So it's exponentially important to mention, again, that police presence in any school programming and or school-related activities and or police and school programs, regardless of the names it goes by, whether the popularly known SRO program or otherwise, perpetuates detrimental impacts of policing in schools. As again, this is a systemic issue and Ontario is not exempt. And someone had made a comment in regards to police officers should have social work, large part of the Police College Foundation of Learning. And we see that, and many times it changes the composition, really look at also additional training and so forth, instead of addressing the systemic and structural issues at the roots that would actually diminish the large expansiveness of police within our everyday lives. And so these are just some other replication of harm for folks to be made aware of. Again, software and technological surveillance, automation of social workers, whether it be psychologists, counselors, and so forth. And so needing to ensure that those that do come into schooling spaces within caring professions are not only representative of the communities that they serve, but also hold a particular politic and track record that's not punitive and carceral, because then we're replicating gets again the same harm. And for folks, if there are some folks that are in post-secondary, in many instances you'll see policing on campus programs, right? Special constables, peace officers, private security, and so forth. So a little bit of a 101 Ontario provincial landscape and terrains. So which names for police and school programs have you heard of, whether at your school board or others that you may have heard of through your friends, colleagues, family members, loved ones? Are there any names on this image that you recognize or any others? Feel free to unmute or put it into chat. So in this image, we're seeing multiple names for police and policing in school programs. And something that's fundamental, yeah, go ahead. You could just unmute.
Yeah, the new Lawrence Heights. I don't remember what they named it, but in Lawrence Heights they have a new like community center, but it's very much run by the police, and it's so that they have a bigger police presence in Lawrence Heights as a reaction to the shootings that happened, I think last year or this past summer. Yeah.
Yeah, the community safety hub that was just opened up. Yeah, thank you so much for bringing that up. And we're going to be connecting the policing and school pieces towards the ending around police within community spaces, which is super important. I see some folks saying some folks had recognized campus police, campus safety special constables, the PLO, which is Police Liaison Officer Program. Absolutely. And so one of the fundamentals for folks to be aware of, you know, it's important to know that although the School Resource Officer Program may be the most popularly known name for police and school programs in K-12 spaces in Ontario, for instance, in British Columbia, the most popularly known name is the Student Liaison Officer Program, the SLO program. But the SRO program, just as the SLO program or otherwise, is literally just one of the multiple known names of police and school programs. And I always say, particularly in Ontario, because the SRO program is most popularly known, that all SRO programs are police in school programs, but not all police in school programs are SRO programs. And so these are just some examples of the names that those programs go by across all education levels. As Khadija had mentioned, campus police, right? Campus safety special constables. Those are specifically to post-secondary institutions. Looking at K-12, right? Child and youth liaison officer, high school liaison officer, youth enhanced deployment, the VIP program, values influences peers program. And this is actually, this image I've been meaning to update it because since there has been so many campaign wins over the years, there has been like this creation of brand new names, rebranding and renaming to a large extent. I see that Roa mentions, wow, I remember VIP when I was in the 6th grade 20 years ago. I just never connected it. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it still exists. Even though researchers have already stated like it does not mean whatever it was set out to do, right? And Khadija says, it seems like they use titles where people cannot make connections to policing. Absolutely. Absolutely. When folks may not necessarily have a full-on awareness, it just may sound like another additional support within the schooling space, right? Even looking at school engagement team officer support program, when Toronto District School Board, when there was a community-led campaign win, the Toronto Catholic District School Board, with the police there, same police had a rebranded program called the SET program instead of the SRO program. So these, again, are just some of the very few examples. And so I want us to talk about funding. And folks, feel free to put in the chat or unmute if by any chance you have an awareness as to who funds or has funded your police and school program or has funded a police and school program of your friends, family, colleagues, or loved one. Feel free to put it in the chat. And also, the reason why I want to talk about funding connects to what happened today, but it's important for folks to be aware that based on where you are situated in what we currently call Ontario, in the local context, funding for police and school programs are either being paid through the funds of local police, right? So essentially through the municipality, right? Your local municipal budget, right? It can be paid through your school board. This could either be fully covered by one of these entities, right? Or is covered in different arrangements for shared costs by more than one of these. So in some cases, you could see half is being paid by police and half is being paid by the school board, or 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, right? So it looks very much different based on where folks are at, or even based on, which I'll go into another example, but again, it's based on where you're locally situated, and this may look different from another space in and across the province. And in the provincial context of Ontario, the provincial government, historically has also been funding police and schools. For instance, through ongoing research, historically, was able to find out that this has been happening historically under the Liberal government or now under the current Doug Ford administration, where millions of dollars have been being funneled into police and schools, currently through the Ministry of Solicitor General. and is currently done so through via grants such as the Community Safety and Policing Grant, Local Priorities. And just today, actually, so that was like from a few years ago, but just today the budget came out that stipulated $41 million for what they call, police and school student resource officers, right? So this is the current reality of this government, who chooses to chronically, as folks had mentioned previously on the systemic issues, it's their choice to chronically underfund education along with social service sectors, meanwhile siphoning funds out of communities and into expanding the carceral system, correctional facilities, multiple bills and legislation that criminalize padding up police budgets and facilitating the aid of what folks call layered policing or tiered policing into everyday spaces and practices. With that said, unfortunately, there isn't actually a lot of transparency. And so it is actually quite difficult when researching, for public access information through public materials as to how much Ontario governments have actually been siphoning funds into police and schools under this administration and otherwise. And this is a foundational reason why a lot of our work also, we do a lot of freedom of informations and also access to information at the federal level as well. And so again, we see, and of course, if there are any post-secondary students here, that there are post-secondary institutions that pay for your campus safety department and so forth. And so we know that this is under provincial jurisdiction, that in regards to K-12 educational spaces, policing carceral measures outside of police presence, including, but not limited to seclusion and restraint, exclusion, and so forth, fall under provincial jurisdiction. And when we're talking about police in schools, it falls under the provincial model for a local police and school board protocol, right? So literally the government, all they could have done if they had the political will was really to amend this provincial model to ensure that we are not having these type of police and policing in school programs, right? And I love that Rowan had mentioned 100% every topic we covered in VIP could have been better covered by an actual educator. Absolutely. And so for us, we've always known, we've had a provincial campaign for multiple years, even prior to Bill 33. We know that this is an intergenerational struggle and that there is a necessity for obtaining incremental wins. We know that a provincial campaign was for also as a preventative measure. We've learned from our partners in the US where, in Oklahoma, in the US, police were replacing teachers due to the manufactured crisis of staff shortage. We saw in Texas with Bill 3, I believe it was the school safety law toolkit, which kind of they mandated police presence, at least one officer in every space. But we also have seen resistance. For instance, our partners in California, and there was a failed attempt at legislation around equating school safety with mandating armed school resource officers, right? And just here more recently, right, we saw in Victoria and British Columbia, government had fired trustees. So due to the creation of a culture of fear and intimidation, they fired the school trustees who were adamant on ensuring police were not brought into their schooling spaces, right? So there was a culture of fear that essentially mandated policing in schools without it actually being legislated, right? And we saw more earlier on, as mentioned, a police academy, Regina, Saskatchewan, as mentioned, a police teacher-led high school. And even prior to Bill 33, if folks might remember, Ontario had a motion 145 by MPP, Conservative MPP Jess Dixon, calling on the Ministry of Education to encourage and support policing in schools, right? And so we've always known that there is, sadly, the capacity of a government to mandate policing in schools and to also ensure that we are then ready with a rapid response and some type of infrastructure to support folks. And I want to ground us in that this isn't a new issue, right? For years, people and organizers have been pushing for the removal of police presence from educational spaces, even prior to the inception of policing free schools. And these are actually just the removals of police and school programs based in Ontario. There's many others in other provinces. But I want to mention that just over the last decade, Ontario has had the most locally based wins. And majority of those wins have been community-led local campaign wins, including many of them led by young people. Also, majority of those student-led campaign wins have also been in Ontario. And so we see that, the first historical precedent for the removal of police in the school program took place in 2017, which was at the Toronto District School Board through a concerted effort. And this happened after almost a decade of police stationed in Toronto schools since 2008, with initial mobilizing and organizing against the police and school program, namely the SRO program, being carried out by community members, educators, students, parents, and caregivers, including at that time Jane Finch Action Against Poverty, JFAP, and the Neighborhood Organized Coalition Opposed to Police in Schools, also known as No Cops, and Northern Secondary School students. And then there was a renewed effort by many others, including JFAP, BLM Toronto, Education Not Incarceration, another organization that is with LAN. And we've seen since then that there were multiple wins, right? We saw in Peel Region where there was a push for the removal at the Hamilton Wentworth District School Board, Hamilton Students for Justice, formerly HWDSB, Kids Need Help. At the Ottawa Carleton District School Board, Iseuli Collective. We saw at the Waterloo Region District School Board, student collectives, namely Students for Inclusive Schools and the Black Brilliance Advisory Committee. At the Upper Grand District School Board, BLM Guelph. We saw also in Simcoe County schools, parents and students speaking out through Reimagine Public Safety Barrie and Parents Against Racism Simcoe. And with all of these wins, I want to be deliberate when drawing a distinction. Yes, these are campaign wins, and despite these wins, policing in schools in many of these spaces has continued under many names and show up differently. So for instance, again, the example in Toronto, at the Toronto District School Board, since the end of the SRO program, we've had neighborhood community officers, right? And they're very much ingrained in those same spaces that they were highly surveilling, particularly areas such as Jane and Finch and so forth, right? So again, just because there has been a removal of a particular police and school program doesn't mean it hasn't been rebranded, reframed, and reinserted, even prior to the legislation that we're going to be looking at just shortly. And so again, why do we have police and school programs across the province? And the following day after the historical removal of the police and school program in November 2017, by way of the community-led campaign win at a press conference, when I was with another organization, I had personally called on the Liberal Minister of Education at that time, Mitzi Hunter, MPP Mitzi Hunter, to step in and remove police from all Ontario schools. And the Minister of Education under the Liberals painted the issue as a local one, right? The truth is that there was a lack of political will. Instead of addressing the systemic issue and reducing harm and ensuring that there were safeguards prior to this conservative government, they chose to perpetuate harm on students. And so I want to know in the chat here, has anyone heard of Bill 33? Even if it's a little bit or a lot, has anyone heard of Bill 33? Yeah, Khadija said no. Priscilla, with all the omnibus bill, sadly no. Yeah, this government likes throwing everything at everyone at the same time. And so when we saw the community-led campaign wins, I'm going to look at this and have folks understand this as an assault on community, and particularly an assault on youth organizing. So Bill 33, I'm going to give some historical context, but also I want to say that Bill 33 has already moved forward. It has already been legislated. But Bill 33, which the current Ontario Minister of Education, Paul Calandra, introduced last year, this past May, since then the legislation has passed. Bill 33 is referred to, Supporting Children and Students Act. It's also known under an act to amend various acts in relation to child, youth, and family services, education, and colleges and universities. It's a wide sweeping legislation, right? So the unpacking of Bill 33 for today, because there are multiple aspects, but today we're going to be focusing on the legislation that's directly related to education, specifically the K-12 public education system, as it speaks to specifically police and policing in schools. So Bill 33 is a wide-reaching legislation, right? It's a sweeping legislation, and specifically in relation to K-12, kindergarten to grade 12 spaces, it expands the minister's authority over schools. So it gives the government and the minister more power. It makes it easier to take over school boards, to both investigate and place boards under supervision, essentially being able to fire trustees, and as part of a broader effort to undermine public education. Meanwhile, again, chronically underfunding education. This is very much about more money for policing and less for schools and students. And the bill, contrary to its title, has nothing to do with supporting students. It has everything to do with decimating public education, widening a pathway towards privatization, concentrating government power by way of a power grab, and most significantly, in regards to today's focus of policing in schools, Bill 33 is concentrating police power over elected school board trustees and school boards, right? It's working to be normalizing further police and policing as a fundamental feature of schooling spaces across the province, right? And Bill 33, this proposal is very much a distraction from what the real issue is. Decimated community-based supports, and a chronically underfunded public education system, 6.3 billion since 2018 and growing. And a government that, again, has a track record of siphoning funds out of public education, community-based services, support systems, and really just funneling it into punitive, criminalizing carceral measures. So we're going to be able to greatly notice through how the legislation is worded, simultaneously what's absent from the legislation, which we'll be looking over shortly, and seeing how their newsroom communicates about this and where proposed regulations are today. So before delving into the specific wording of the legislation and the regulations proposed for the legislation, what you're seeing is a headline part of a statement, one of their earliest statements, I believe it was the initial news release, that accompanied the announcement of the bill. So it's important to recognize how the provincial government, through their communications on this bill again, move forward with that false narrative, right, that we spoke earlier on in this educational teaching. Right, we're going to see their communications on this bill, including through the Ontario newsroom, how they were framing this legislation, right, as, again, I'm seeing this as part of a process to manufacture consent, to manufacture consensus, and very much about propaganda, police propaganda for the wider public, and to be able to control their narrative. The narrative surrounding Bill 33 can be noticed through the title and subtitle that the government released. Non-surprisingly, attempts to conflate this bill, including its measures of policing in schools, right? Whether it be police presence in any school property, police in any school programming and or school-related activities, and or police in school programs, regardless of the names it goes by, right? So a lot of the language is around helping protect children and youth, promoting student success. So equating, again, as we see in pre-K spaces, pre-kindergarten or early learning centers, where you see the socialization of children into police are community helpers, right? So we see these same narratives, helping protect children and youth, promoting student success by having police in schools. And so this is also part of the announcement, and we see here also the framing and the understanding of policing in schools with notions of increasing safety, increasing well-being, increasing academic and personal achievement, promoting student success, enhancing student safety. So really much, again, concretizing police as a necessity, not just as an add-on, but as a necessity and a feature for a successful education for young people. And so these statements are, again, also part of the announcement. And these narratives, the framing of this issue that they're putting forward are not new whatsoever, including the attempts to conflate police and school programs with relationship building and fostering of trust, safety, mentorship, or stronger relationships between students, educators, and law enforcement, right, as a means to create secure learning environments that promote trust between communities and as a means to building quote unquote stronger and safer communities, right? So this is indeed a public relations, propaganda machine. Again, police propaganda for police despite harms it will cause. Meanwhile, in reality, the harms of school-based policing will be exacerbated and the school-prison nexus entrenched across the province. There's already Canadian-based research, including Ontario-based research that debunks the narrative of relationship building. For instance, a couple of examples, Toronto, Ontario-based Gita Ramadan, community organizer and educator. They had done their thesis on, really debunking this. Another example, Edmonton and Alberta-based professor Alexander Da Costa had authored a relationship building and the normalization of police in schools and really looking at the emergence of the SRO programs in Canada. And so Bill 33, when we're moving over now to specific wording of the legislation, so this is the legislation specifically to K-12 spaces and also policing in schools. It's important to take note of what and how things are worded within the legislation and simultaneously, again, what wasn't present. So part of this wide-ranging legislation that we're zoning in on is that this legislation, through a government power grab, inherently, again, embeds and provincializes the automation, right? So it's automating policing in schools, both through police and school programs and beyond. So I want to be clear that Bill 33 is not just about police and school programs. It's about policing in schools, including police and school programs, but not just police and school programs. And so this legislation that centralizes police power by concentrating police decision-making authority over school boards, which of course is an undemocratic move, ultimately would be a mandate for police in schools, right? Policing in schools across the province, including policing in school programs. So the automation of police in schools and this government essentially creating police and policing in schools as a cornerstone is done so in multiple ways. By essentially the creation of a culture of fear and intimidation tactics through the threat of placing school boards under supervision with their increased powers to take over school boards. They can choose to move ahead with placing boards under supervision to swiftly either bring back police and school programs or placing them under supervision to ensure that policing in schools is maintained. If boards were or would be considered as thinking of moving towards the removal of police presence within schooling spaces, would then be able to swiftly place them under supervision. Or by making those boards who had previously removed them to retreat back and either bring back policing within schooling spaces or also put them under supervision to for the government to do it themselves as well, right? So we're going to be looking at each relevant part for today's teaching line by line. So we see here that matter of public interest is not defined. So literally under this legislation, Bill 33, anything and everything could be considered a matter of public interest, meaning a board can be placed under investigation. Wait. Under investigation, literally for almost any reason, under the whole notion that they're doing it under public interest, right? So boards can be placed under investigation, and of course, possible actions that may be taken after that investigation. So trustees being fired, being placed under supervision, and policing in schools can very much be and would be and will be, because it's now legislated, be considered a public interest. And so we're seeing on the next amendment, as previously mentioned, as matter of public interest isn't defined, and anything and everything could be considered a matter of public interest. The minister essentially becomes the lead or head school trustee of the province, right? They'll be equipped to give directions to the board to address a supposed matter of public interest or simply take them over. The government would be able to do this whether the board has done or not done something, or through the possibility of being likely to do something or not do something. Essentially predictive policing of school boards and elected school trustees, right? To state that something they will do or not do can affect this dubbed matter of public interest, making it easier for school boards to be placed under supervision essentially for any reason, including under the pretense of policing in schools. And in relation to police in schools, again, as will be considered a public interest issue under the pretense of school safety, student and educator safety, community safety, school violence, relationship building with police, and so forth. And so as previously mentioned, in regards to how policing in schools is funded in multiple ways in Ontario, this is something that we didn't get an answer to until today's budget, right, from the province. But this particular amendment, number 4, could very well be the possibility of obligating school boards to pay for police and school programs out of their own school board expenses by creation of a policy and guideline on this matter. As we know, as of today, the provincial budget coming from a provincial funding is going to be $41 million. And so number 5, this is now the section that directly speaks to and is specific to police and school programs and policing in schools. As I earlier mentioned, this isn't just about police and school programs. If anyone has been told this was solely about these particular programs, this is actually only one aspect of it, which we'll notice when we have a look at the proposed regulations for this legislation. And so I see that Khadija mentioned controlling expensive school boards by taking over. Yeah. So, and they wouldn't actually necessarily even have to take over the school board. They're able to just give directives to establish what particular like policies and guidelines, like what they have to spend on or can't spend on and so forth if they wanted to. So it's like that, the overarching power. And so when we're distinguishing, it's important to make that distinction, right, between police and school programs and police presence, right? That this government is looking for police having access to school premises, permitting police to participate in school programs, creating police and policing presence in multiple ways, right? So it's not just about the SRO program, but the full-on access of police to all spaces, premises, and programming. And so what we're going to see afterwards is really this reality that it's not just about a particular program, right? And of course, the government tries to close off any loopholes with number 7 by essentially giving themselves regulation-making powers in relation to any of the amendments, right? And so earlier, late last year, they had opened up again the Ontario Regulatory Registry to hear comments from folks. The government doesn't actually, sadly, take into consideration these comments. They're supposed to, so it's good for when we have to FOI them and be like, hey, well, community mentioned this, but you did that. But with that said, this was the proposal for the regulations. And so a proposal for the regulations is how is it that the legislation that has passed now, how are they going to operationalize the statutory changes under the Education Act based on what has passed, right? And so this is part of the proposal for regulations. As I mentioned previously, this was never just about a police and school program. We're seeing, again, access to school premises and participation in school programs, which, they were transparent about that, right? Here we're seeing that it's about access to school premises and participation in school programs for any of the following activities, events, or programs. So literally for anything and everything, right? They're talking about here, they have community and student safety program, right? You're talking about school resource officer program, which may also be called a youth engagement officer program, right? A road and driving safety program, which, mind you, which we'll talk about with the community piece. The Children's Breakfast Place is already in partnership with police in Toronto to give young people and students driving lessons. You don't need police for that, right? So here they have a learning and mentorship program, youth engagement program, student well-being program, a program to build relationships between local police services and students, right? And so I want to mention something to that. Police have been taking over people's jobs, right? A lot of the presentations that police are doing across the province, a lot of them are within the education curriculum, such as physical health and education, right? Why are police coming in talking about consent, healthy relationships? They're talking about gender-based violence and so forth, even when police themselves are disproportionately perpetrators. And in Ontario, one third of police officers who are on paid suspension leave is due to gender-based violence, right? But even when speaking with nonprofits and organizations that used to be called in to support schools with particular, extracurricular activities and so forth, it has been majority-wise police being called in, right? And so I want to give that caveat that this is very much an expansiveness of police being embedded into everyday practices of the schooling space, much more than previously. And at the bottom, we see that for any of the above activities, events, or programs, that the government says if they are being delivered by a board at a location off school premises, the board will also be required to permit police services participation and provide access to the location. So even if we wanted to have schools be able to have tactics to reduce harm and ensure that then, certain school-related activities are happening off property to reduce contact with police, they are now obligating police to have that information so that police then can go to off-site schooling and education events, programming, and or activities, right? And so we're seeing it's a full entrenchment, right? And we know that in regards to the provincial model for local police and school board protocol, at the top left, you'll see that here states police will continue to have access to schools in the event of an emergency and or when there is an immediate threat, right? And they talk about it being consistent with the requirements already set on the provincial model for local police and school board protocol. So the reality is that there was already a mandate of police presence, but that mandate was ensuring the least amount of interaction for the possibility of adverse police contact with young people, right? And so we're seeing that the proposed regulations is for, again, very much an infiltration of police within every facet of school life. And so when we're talking about changing landscape for organizing, this is legislation, right? And in recent history, prior to Bill 33 being legislated, solely with the introduction of Bill 33, despite it not having even been legislated at the time, it actually had already changed the terrains in local spaces across the province. And in regards to school boards, one of the things that was on our radar are how those trustees who had been attempting to either bring back or expand policing in schools based on where they were locally situated, utilized Bill 33 even prior to it being legislated as a rationalization to open up the matter once again. Right, for instance, we saw at the Ottawa Carleton District School Board, where our partners at Silu Collective had a student-led win campaign there. Due to the proposed legislation at that time of Bill 33, Trustee Blackburn recently on last June already had put forward a motion yet again, because this school trustee tends to try multiple times and in multiple ways in relation to police, right? And the redundancy of this motion, because they continuously try, was struck out due to the supposed quote unquote evolving nature of what the government has proposed, right? The Ottawa Carleton District School Board example, in that example, there was pushback, right? The motion was put to a vote recently, last year also, and it passed, sadly, with a majority of 7 trustees voting in favor. And so we're seeing these ways on their motion really spoke about engaging in discussions, right? Establishing standards of practice and so forth, right? We saw at the Waterloo Region District School Board, former police officer, now a trustee there, had attempted to retract the student-led win there, right? And that was in Waterloo. Again, at that time, despite Bill 33 only having been introduced, there were additional pressures, right, on local organizing, including campaigns to place pressure even prior to it being legislated. Since being legislated, there had to be a rapid response campaign in Peel, where in partnership, Policing Free Schools, our Peel campaign-based partners, and the Peel Elementary Teachers Local had to push back on a motion that would have expedited Bill 33's reality prior to it even being legislated, right? And so as for school boards that are under supervision, but as well to every other school board locally, due to how easy it's going to be to place boards under supervision, it's increasingly important for folks to get involved in their school committees, right? We're talking about folks as parents and caregivers getting involved, particularly at parent involvement committees, placing pressure on supervisor, the appointed supervisor and senior staff for preemptive policies and procedures that would mitigate and or reduce harm prior to the legislation having gone through, and just as important now that the legislation has gone through, right? Another example pre-legislation, in the areas, the Thames Valley District School Board serves the Elgin, Middlesex, Oxford, London area, right? And so on the heels of Bill 33, St. Thomas, their head of police, was already pushing for a reformist approach, right? They were talking on working to reestablish, refresh, and reimagine the role, right, of police in schools, right? Shortly thereafter, 4 months after the province took over the Thames Valley District School Board, there was already a news media release that policing in schools was going to continue within their schooling spaces, right? So we know that Bill 33, particularly to the policing in schools issue, was already being exercised prior to it actually becoming a legislation. And so what we know is that it will now be that much more expedited, because it now has already become legislation, right? And I want folks to keep in mind also that at the moment, the majority of school boards that have all been taken over are school boards where the original and initial police and school programs, in one way or another, were removed, right? So there's also direct correlation with the majority of the takeover of school boards and policing in schools, including across the province, right? And so we see the changing landscape of organizing really shifting towards recognizing whether your school boards are under supervision or if it's not. So for those who still have elected trustees that are in power, the prioritization would be, of course, inside-outside relationship building and organizing, as well as pressure on trustees, and preemptive policies and procedures that would seek to mitigate and or reduce harm, while being mindful that in those acts, then the school board may possibly then be taken over, right? Due to a matter of public interest, right? And so we're seeing that the changing landscape also impacts at the municipal level. So many of us already know that police budgets continue to balloon, continuously balloon, and this will be yet another reason for police to ask for further increased budgets from council members to implement in schooling spaces, right? And so we're seeing that organizing level is both at the provincial level of really recognizing that we need to be further engaged in electoral political organizing as a way and as a vehicle to further community or to further community organizing goals, but also working at municipal levels in distinct ways. So I'm going to go into the next piece around this not just being a Toronto issue, because this is something that had really happened. And so I just want to gauge in with folks because I know that's quite a bit of information. Do folks want to have like a 5-minute break? Like do a stretch, get some snacks, get some goodies, and then be back. So I have we're at 7:17. So 7:22. Does that work for folks? Okay, awesome. Yeah. Okay, awesome. See y'all in 5 minutes. tour. The campaign trail consisted of 10 local stops across the province and a span of about a month and a half prior to the first day that the legislature came back. And then because this again connected with the issue that Bill 33, what happens here also impacts what happens in other spaces, and what happens in other spaces also impacts us here. Being able to ensure that our partners wrote in, so Advancement Project on behalf of also Alliance for Educational Justice from the US, Northern Police Monitoring Project and Kids of Color from the UK, Bottom Up Reimagine Our Schools from South Africa, and also supporters that are based in what's currently known today as New Zealand and Australia. And so also ensuring then that our partners came here, because in many instances, sadly, we have a majority Ford government that regardless of protests, regardless of how many folks come out to the streets, and so we attempted a different avenue by ensuring that international partners would be able to be here for an international solidarity press conference, and then holding actually at the Jane Finch Mall at the Jane Finch Community Engagement Space, having a International Police and Policing Free School Symposium that was open to the public to be able to learn directly from those on the ground, connecting our local terrains, our provincial landscape, connecting it to the international landscape and terrains as well, and just learning as to where we are today in the struggle for police and policing free school futures, really learning about the co-optation, the expansion of policing in schools and so forth. And so I want to bring us back to Bill 33, Changing Landscape, and the local trends of organizing, and how that for us right now, we're really in building out infrastructure, structural care for collective resistance, knowing that until we have the next election, because in Ontario, we don't have a power to recall elected officials, that the Doug Ford government is going to be moving forward with how and what they like, right? And so we're going to be going to our structural care and collective resistance, and at the same time, wanting to acknowledge those who are most detrimentally, negatively impacted by policing in schools, and that must be at the center of those supports. And detrimental, negatively impacts Black, Indigenous, Black Afro-Indigenous, racialized students, neurodivergent students, disabled students, queer and trans students as well. And we know that this is a systemic issue. And in many instances, folks will be like, hey, well, there's a bunch of the specific data and reports on this police violence that's more highlighted in the US, but we know it's a systemic issue, right? For instance, and again, here we're going to be, so just an activation warning, a content and trigger warning that we are going to be talking about physical violence, including gender-based violence and sexual violence. And so just giving folks a moment there. So this is a systematic reality that here in Ontario, we've seen police physically assaulting Black girls and then charging the students and saying that they were the ones who assaulted police, right? We've had our actually in Peel-based partners that had to do rapid response and supports with them. We've seen, police of shackling 6-year-old Black girls. We've seen testimonials of Black youth, including Black girls and gender nonconforming Black youth, speak to how they're detrimentally impacted, right? And so a lot of the information that does come from the US really provides frameworks on what those gaps are, and also recognizing that we don't need more data reports and research to acknowledge what has already been told in students' testimonials, right? And it's important that we recognize the issue of police in schools, the advocacy and organizing for policing for schools also as a gender-based violence issue. There's an assistant professor who researches Canadian public law at Ontario-based Brock University, Danielle McNabb, who had previously spoken to the reality that within the literature on gender-based violence, that police are disproportionately perpetrators, right? And as mentioned previously, right, that data pertaining to over a decade, that 1 in 3 police, again, right, with paid suspensions, as mentioned before, involve gender-based violence, right? So some of those harmful impacts, and particularly on Black youth, including regarding gender-based violence, are found within community-based research, including right here in Ontario, right? Whether it be by Ottawa-based Partners Sealy Collective's report titled Ottawa Students Speak Out, Cops Out of Our Schools. There's testimonials based out of our partners in Winnipeg, Manitoba, by Police Free Schools Winnipeg, and so forth, right? And so it's been reported that school resource officers or your police in schools, regardless of names, reinforce a culture of gender-based violence, including sexual violence, where victims and survivors were shamed, intimidated into silence, and even threatened with being criminalized themselves. There was a perpetuation of rape culture being present. Officers actively undermining and dismissing survivors' experiences, including that of youth dating violence, intimate partner violence, accusing them of lying, counts of acts of sexual and gendered harassment from SROs themselves against gender oppressed, gender non-conforming, non-binary students, along with SRO-led efforts that were there supposedly to tackle sexual violence, again, focused on victim blaming rhetoric. So we have an awareness already that this is very much an issue. And so when moving from knowledge to action, I'm going to speak briefly on some, one that has already happened, but some of the initiatives that are coming up, underway, and then we'll be able to connect further in community knowledge exchange. And so for the Know Your Rights, Know Your Reality, and I'll be able to send this over to Roa to send out to registered participants. So we already did a webinar with 3 lawyers around knowing your rights. So one of our partners based out in BC is the British Columbia Civil Liberties Association. So they actually have a national mandate. So there's a Police in Schools pocketbook, which I'll also send the link to the PDF format. And they might still have like the physical ones that folks can order. But this was created specifically as a national resource guide, right? To provide information on student rights during interactions with police in schools. And so we know that, you know, some folks may know that they have the right to remain silent, but it's important for young people, particularly within schooling spaces, to know that if they suspect an undercover officer is present, which in many spaces they are, that they're able to ask for their name, their badge number, and all that information. That they have a constitutional right to film and photograph police, but also what does that mean in Ontario when students are not allowed or are not supposed to have, you know, their phones on them, right? The right to remain silent, but knowing that there must be a parent, a caregiver, an adult. When we're seeing many students are being interviewed by police without adult presence, right? And so we're seeing the reality that even if you know your rights, you need to know your reality, because knowing your reality means that despite having rights, your rights are for the court. Because the reality is that even if you know your rights, it doesn't mean that police officers are going to respect those rights, right? And so it's, I believe, like almost a 1 hour, almost a 2 hour webinar. I'll send that over so that folks are able to know their rights, know their reality, The other piece on that, folks are just as safe as others around them within the space, knowing their rights. Because police officers may then speak to someone else that may not necessarily know their rights and divulge information unknowingly. What's underway is called Assault at Canada. This initiative is actually directly inspired by our US partners, Advancement Project and the Alliance for Educational Justice. And so we're going to be training and building up capacity for communities to support and care for young people and their families when police violence and police brutality happen in schools or in school-related activities. And really just honing in on creating a community of care rapid response Assault at network. And so due to the presence of police and policing in schooling and educational spaces, and particularly in Ontario with it now being mandated come September, this increase of contact and interactions places students at a heightened risk of police violence. And so our US partners had co-created the Assault at training. They've been able to also chronicle more than over 300 acts of police violence against students since 2007. And so we were trained up. So from our partners who was able to attend the sessions, we were trained up almost 2 years ago by our US partners. And so we've had our partners at the British Columbia Civil Liberties Association, quote unquote, Canadianized, for lack of a better term, Canadianize the legal information. And the rest is being shifted into our particular local landscapes. And so the idea is that the acts of police violence, of course, being tracked by, community-based tracking, but then also being able to train up community members to build up their capacity to be trained the trainers and provide rapid response support when an assault at happens. So we're going to be having a reporting tool. And the idea is to build up a national community of care assault at rapid response network to ensure that when police violence does happen in educational spaces, that then young people and their families are able to be supported and not be alone. The other piece, and I want to ask folks before I get into this other initiative that's also underway, Assault at is supposed to be coming out in August. I'm pretty sure we're going to be doing the trainings, but I can also send out that information when it does get made public. Underway is what we call policing free spaces. So I want to know from folks, feel free to put in the chat or unmute, if you've ever been to a community center, a community space that was solely supposedly meant for young people or intergenerational folks, or just anyone in community, or any programming spaces that has had police presence or agents of policing. So feel free to put in the chat or unmute. And Policing Free Spaces is an initiative that's going to be working to unmask the collusion involving organizations, also influential individuals with agents and systems of policing, and the creation of calls to action for respite spaces for children and young people away from policing. So that much more important, even though this was already underway prior to Bill 33, we've been collecting a lot of information from, I think, 3-4 years now, around like this trending of seeing police and agents of policing within community spaces, and particularly community and youth programming. So it's looking at unmasking this collusion and then having creation of calls to action for the respite spaces, right? So acknowledging that equitable access to community space and programming is essential in the presence of policing community spaces, policing community programming, and particularly policing community youth programming impedes this access. It really is that people and organizations have a responsibility to engage in ongoing deep unlearnings and relearnings around this issue, adopting safeguarding practices and moving towards a larger transformative systems change, and recognizing that young people are policed on the bus, in the malls, in the streets, right? In schools, especially now Ontario mandating policing in schools, also in community and community spaces, community centers, and grassroots spaces even, right? And fundamentally that there is an increased responsibility on collectives, organizations, nonprofits, grassroots, or otherwise, to ensure that those third spaces that young people are attending are respite spaces away from policing and having this increased necessity. And so our Policing Free Spaces initiative really comes out of our conversations also with Food Share Toronto. So we've utilized this policy response, recognizing it as a practice that mitigates and reduces harm and reduces barriers for access to community space and programming, and as an entry point to a continuum of transformative changes. And we got permission from Food Share Toronto personnel to be able to expand on this, and we're creating a pledge, right? And the pledge is going to be an amended version of this. And there's going to be multiple iterations, including for nonprofits, charities, associations, grassroots, artists, creatives, academics, and funders. And Food Share's Toronto policy, for instance, they talk about supporting staff members when they ask police to leave community spaces, not partnering with police, not inviting police, not applying for funding where you're stipulated to work with police. And a short example, I'll do a quick example of this, and then we'll go into discussion or any questions. This is actually part of a different workshop, but I'll just speak briefly to it as a quick example as to why we need and the importance of Policing Free Spaces initiative that is underway as well. So this, by all means, although the example I'll be using is the case study of YACE, the Youth Association for Academics, Athletics, and Character Education, which is also based in Jane Finch. I do want to say that this is a systemic issue. And the reason why YACE has been utilized as a case study is because it has had the most expansiveness of policing carceral culture and practices and replication of carceral functions, and facilitating an expansiveness of agents of policing within their spaces, right? But again, like even in Jane Finch, Boys and Girls Jane Finch Club, San Romano Way, Revitalization Association, and so forth, have many ties to like this carceral webbing, right? And a lot of this is through public access information that we've been looking at. And so, for instance, even when folks are grounded in their spaces, for instance, the founding director of this organization, having been a former elementary teacher in the Jane Finch area, which is very much aware of what the conditions and politics are in the neighborhood, yet despite under his leadership, replications of policing carceral functions persisted, right? So we're talking about organizations' proximity to police stations, literally right across 31 division. We're talking about folks being hired. So for a quick example, this person was a former corrections officer, the founding head of the Ontario Correctional Intelligence Unit, right? You have another person who was hired, who's a former Toronto police officer, right? And the connection of this, it's beyond presence, right? It's further expanding and enhancing carceral practices and policies within their own spaces. Another example, law enforcement on their board member, which again, this is not new. There's many organizations that sadly do this, but we see, collaboration on community, like on youth programming, right? Police don't have to be present for robotics programming, right? They don't need to be in any type of collaboration, right? The amplification of police-led programs, right? Like this propagating police propaganda, utilizing academics for their research to, again, as a means to legitimize. We see a means to legitimize police and carceral presence through eldership as well, right? And we're seeing this through like social media channels, public access information. And so we're seeing these connections of nonprofits, organizations, and this carceral webbing, especially when it's connected to funding. And one of the particular things that's most concerning with the example of YACE is that they have shifted over to being a Black mandated, Black led, Black serving organization. And many instances are hurting those same young people they purport to be supporting. And so in making the connection of Bill 33, the School Prison Nexus, initiatives that are underway, and the utmost necessity to have those, out as soon as possible, is that much more important, especially for spaces where we're seeing a mandate of policing in schools. And so I'll just leave our website here and then folks can all unmute, but this is our contact information. Right now, like, it's a bit slow to get back on emails. So if anything is urgent or time sensitive, just put it on the subject line matter, just because, yeah, have come out of a 1-year rapid response. And so have like hundreds of emails like going through. But yeah, folks still feel free to connect with us, follow us. Here's our website. And yeah, I just want to connect with folks on, wait, let me move this out of the way so I can see everybody. Okay, let me bring this over here. Yeah. So yeah, so are there any is there anyone currently right now in a high school or or have loved ones or family members? Or what's the scariest thing for y'all knowing about Bill 33 and knowing that it's like mandating policing in schools now and there's kind of like no escape? Just really daunting, to say the least. It's like,
Don't be shy, folks. You can go ahead and unmute. Habiba, go ahead.
Hi. I just wanted to say thank you so much for hosting this event tonight. It's very informative and it's very well put together. I just had a question, like I'm just curious. Um, I wanted to know if by any chance like this is going on in like Catholic schools as well. And if so, like what is their response to the Bill 33?
yeah, it is happening in Catholic school boards, and even historically, if folks remember where the like campaign wins were for the removal of police and school programs, there wasn't one that like intrinsically was like, hey, this is wrong, this is impacting students, let's remove this, right? And so Catholic school boards have tended to keep their programs. So for instance, the Thames Valley District School Board in like the London, Elgin, Middlesex, Oxford area,
Mm-hmm.
with the exact same report, made two completely different decisions. The Thames Valley District School Board, the public board there, decided to remove, and the Catholic public board decided to keep, and they had the exact same information. This has happened in multiple other spaces where the Catholic school boards will continuously keep them. And if anything, in many instances have been advocating and like spreading police propaganda around like it's a great program and like it's great to have them here because like if we're understaffed, they're another person we can use. With that said, since last year when connecting with unions, that OECTA, like that union, didn't respond to any of our asks to come out for any press conferences or any action items. It was only through a comrade, one of our community partners, that connected to one of their like higher senior staff leadership folks. And then they felt, I guess they felt a bit ashamed that, y'all are the only union that hasn't come out in support. But with that stated, even with the school board association, you notice that like folks internally have had to tell me, hey, Andrea, they're not going to do anything because there's people in there that actually believe we need police to keep us safe from students,
Mm.
which is really sad.
Mm.
And I see Khadija mentions
Wow.
it's making me make connections as to how funding could be funneled into great programs for students like tutoring or breakfast programs, even like, but it is instead being funneled into policing programs. Yeah. Yeah, it's wild. Like also police get a lot of private donations. Like police have founded their own nonprofits, like Pro Action Cops and Kids is one example. And so there's a bunch of them across the country, and like you have people giving a shitload of money, private donations to police. And so if you're even looking at it, you have police that have the capacity and have the amount of funds, whether it be at the municipal level or through other funding, to really like be that much expansive and take over like the social service sector and youth programming sector, because we've heard of like they do boxing programs, they do driving lessons, um, they do soccer programs, they like almost everything and anything, you name it, they're doing it. Yeah, go ahead, just unmute.
I had this relationship, or do have a relationship with this Latin American center, and like how much they're in needing of funding, and the most like adamant people that have come in that want to support the program is police programming, and like supporting the barbecue because that's a fun, exciting thing. And I remember they were working with our the Violence Against Women's program, where they wanted to sit down with survivors of gender-based violence and have a police presence there to be the safe space where Spanish-speaking survivors of gender-based violence can speak to police officers and have this space, Spanish-speaking space, and then even like workers in the center having family members in police. There was an encampment in near our area, near the building, and that being a sort of source of tension for the center and the encampment and the residents of the encampment, and eventually like a strong police presence, feeling the need to bring that to get rid of it. And yeah, just how connected it is, and how adamant they are in our spaces. Yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for sharing that. It's pretty well. Is it the Center for Spanish Speaking Peoples, Jane Wilson? Yeah, they've been horrific for decades. Yeah, it's wild because ironically or oddly enough, my brother's a police officer. Um, and so even like when like I have folks that are like, oh well, family members is someone, it's like you're still able, like I get it, there's cognitive dissonance, but you're still able to understand this is a systemic issue. This is not about individual officers. This is a systemic issue that needs to be uprooted. But that work, that unlearning, it's a lot longer, right? It's like a larger process, and it's sad that even like in regards to what you mentioned around which programming that tends to get that much more support. We've seen a lot of also where organizations that are in need of funds, you'll have police that'll say, hey, if you want to work with us or we'll collaborate, we'll partner, and we'll give you the funds. You can get your program going, right? Or in other spaces, in order to get certain funding, you're stipulated to have to work with police, right? So we're seeing an example in Toronto, like we've been noticing that police have now kind of become like an intermediary of funds for nonprofits. And the nonprofits in particular that are that much tighter with police are getting a lot more funding than the ones who aren't. You see Khadija is saying, I'm curious how can teachers change things like grading when it comes to harmful policing practices for students in educational spaces. Yeah, there's and I think the piece around that is like having to look at what is already out there. There's other spaces that are not looking at doing grading, and then being able to learn on how to then bring those here. But the thing is, under Doug Ford government, a lot of what can be done is not going to be done. And that's just the reality, especially with like the standardized testing. Even though it's like folks know it's like a waste of money, it doesn't actually, speak to like the smarts of a young person or so to speak, but they're still putting much more money into standardized testing.
I just have a quick question. Do you think like the Bill 33 could like be revoked or like repealed, like removed, I guess?
Yeah.
Because it seems like it's been repackaged into like many other different forms, and it can be repackaged again if it is revoked. So I'm just like curious if there's a way to like, I don't know, completely remove it. Probably not, but I'm just curious about like what you have to say about this.
Yeah, technically, and like still strategically, we are going to be organizing around asking for repeal. But as an organizer with like and acknowledging like where we're at in this government, it's about reducing harm and creating networks of support, of care for young people and their families, because sadly we don't have a minority government at this time. We have like provincially, and because we have a majority for government, they're able to do whatever they want, right? And the reality is that this isn't something that Doug Ford would do, especially when the easiest point to get reelected is around being tough. Law and order, more police for creating safety, like that normalized assumption is something that is widespread. Sadly, also, we don't have the power to recall elected officials in Ontario. I guess like the reality is it's possible, but then as organizers and reckoning that like we do grassroots work is like also being like, where's the energy going into? So last year was around like a lot of political education, awareness, making sure that folks across the province knew that, hey, this is impacting y'all's, right? And then this year, during the summer when we're going to be doing the trainings, is having these initiatives prior to the start of the school year. And then going to be doing also some political education. But unless if there was like a general strike, a student strike, it makes it that much harder. And so we have one of our partners, it's all high school students. And they also have a lot of challenges, right? Even in regards to access